Hi everyone, welcome to our 42nd session of the MedAI Group Exchange. This week, we have Petar Stojanov from the Broad Institute here with us to present his work on domain adaptation with invariant representation learning. Petar is a postdoc at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, working with professors Gad Getz and Caroline Uhler. He received his PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University, where he was advised by Profs Jaime Carbonell and Kun Zhang. He is broadly interested in different aspects of machine learning and computational biology, including transfer learning and domain adaptation from causal perspective. He is currently working on applying causal discovery to improve genomic analysis of cancer mutation, as well as single-cell RNA sequencing data to understand cancer progression. Thank you so much, Petar, for joining us today. Before we start, could you tell us your preference on how you want to take questions?
Whatever people prefer, I'm good either way.
Sounds good. So let's try to make this session as interactive as possible. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Petar.
Okay, so thank you for having me. Let me just minimize something so I can see. So let me just put it here. Can you see this? Do you see yourself or no? You just see the presentation, right?
Yep, just the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about something that we presented at NeurIPS in December about domain adaptation. I know that right now I'm working on computational biology more, and I'm trying to do more causality related things, but this is going to be a transfer learning talk. And only causal stuff is going to be some motivational kind of perspectives on the problem. And so to motivate the problem, we all know that we need transfer learning. I think a lot of the people here are kind of aware of this problem, and that's because we have different kinds of domains of application in which we have a lot of need for different kinds of data to train the models, and even though we have a lot of data, oftentimes this doesn't generalize to a new setting. For example, if we have a kind of a Google Assistant kind of application, new accents have notoriously been a problem for this kinds of applications. And also when we have any kind of image recognition, things can change, like the setting can change, the camera can change. We can have a daytime, nighttime, things like that. And so I think self-driving cars, don't need to talk about that in detail. I think that's already like an extreme version of this problem where things can change on the fly, and it's a very dangerous thing when the model doesn't generalize correctly. So rigorously speaking, a lot of the time we're assuming that the training and the test data come from the same joint distribution, and there are IID samples from the same joint distribution. And so that means that we have some data like this, and it's labeled, and we want to, for example, recognize objects, and we're assuming that all the data is going to be kind of from the same distribution. But in practice, a lot of the times we're going to have training data that's maybe in daytime and test data that's in nighttime, and now the joint distribution between the labels and the features is going to be different. And so that's just a very kind of broad way of explaining the problem. But we can go into a little bit more detail to see how we can solve it. And before I go further, one thing that we want to assume, and this will come up a bit more clearly later, is that if we want to do any kind of domain adaptation, we have to assume that there is some structure in the way this joint distribution changes. For example, in this particular case, we can see that only the light changes, for example, or some small kind of change that doesn't distort the semantic content of the image, for example, right? So how do we represent that? We'll see that later. But for now, we're going to go through a little thought experiment to see why causal direction may be important for transfer learning. So assume that we have a bunch of people that come into a room, and they all come up with some number, and then they write it down. And say they all have different styles. So this is kind of the change in the distribution that we see here. And then we have another person that comes in, and they don't tell us the number that they want to write down. They just write it down. And now we have to predict what number that person wrote down. And so it's easy to see that, first of all, even the image itself contains a lot of information about what they might be thinking. So there's something that we can work with. But also, all of the information that we have from the previous people and their styles can be somehow related to the new style that we just observed. And then maybe we can reconstruct what the joint distribution looks like for this new person and what the probability of Y is given what we just observed. On the other hand, let's flip the scenario. So let's look at what happened if we want to predict what the writing is, not what the person thought of. So let's say that everyone's thinking their number, they're telling it to us, they're writing down this in terms of their handwritten style. We take the pixels, and then when the next person comes in and they think of the number 5, and now we have to predict what they're going to write. So how can we do adaptation now? And is there any way we can use the previous styles that we just saw to deduce what they're going to write? And it's actually been shown that the best we can do is just take the average and come up with like some style that they can that they might have. But it's pretty kind of intuitive right now that if the causal direction is from Y to X, in this case, person thinks of the number, then they write it down. So in this causal direction, actually, it makes a difference what we're trying to predict. If we're trying to predict the effect from the cause, it's more difficult than if we're trying to predict the cause from the effect. And so why is this the case? Well, one way to describe a causal process like this is that Y is generated from some distribution EY right here. And then we can think of X as being a function of Y and some noise term that's unique to X and independent of all the other noise terms. And so if we think of the generating process this way, we can see that when these things change, they have to change independently. So the fraction of 5s that people think of, and then the process of taking the image and writing the thing down is it can change completely independently. And so if you think about that, and if you think about these two generating processes and you write them down in terms of two probability distributions which represent the physical processes in nature, you can say that the distribution P of Y and the distribution P of X given Y, they change independently from each other. So that is useful information to gather here, because then if we deduce that they change independently, P of X and P of Y given X must change dependently. And so this is the reason, and this is you can derive this from Bayes' rule. So if these two are their parameters change independently from each other, then the parameters of these two have to be coupled. And so if that's the case, then there's two things that we can deduce from here. That this kind of factoring of the joint distribution represents factoring in which the change is the smallest. So the overall number of parameters of change in the joint distribution is going to be the smallest if we just take the independently changing parts and just add them together. Whereas here, if they change dependently, we can the dimensionality of the change is going to be much higher that we're going to see if we factor it this way. And so this also explains why P of X has information about Py given X, or about the joint distribution. And it also explains why when you predict the cause from the effect, the marginal distribution is actually useful in the target domain. Whereas in the other scenario, it's not, there is no marginal distribution, and just the cause itself is not useful. And so usually, so I'm just going to briefly describe one more detail in which here you know the causal direction, you know the variables in the system, and you know how they're related to each other. A lot of the times, because of the sampling process and because of hidden confounders, you don't know the actual causal relationship between the variables. And so you cannot necessarily assign roles to these factors of the joint distribution in causal terms, but oftentimes you can still factor the distribution into independently changing parts. So for example, if you have, so for example, in covariate shift here, you can have a situation in which the actual underlying causal process is sample selection bias, but what you actually observe is a change in the marginal of X, and the conditional of Y given X is the same. And so it's not necessarily the causal relationship of the physical process that took place, is the joint distribution that we observe at the end, and whether we can factor it in certain parts that change and don't change. So it doesn't have to have a necessarily interventional interpretation. I just want to make sure that that's clear to people before I go on. So I've worked on several of these kind of settings, so you can have different ways in which the joint distribution can change across domains. And for example, you can have the marginal changing and the conditional of the label that we're trying to predict given the marginal is the same. So it's the same decision boundary, but different marginals. And then we can have target shift in which just the class prior changes. We can have conditional shift in which the class conditional of the features given the label changes, but the prior of the label doesn't change. And then we can have kind of conditional target shift in which the class prior changes and the class conditional change, but they change independently. And so I worked in kind of like 3 of these 4 scenarios. And of course, these scenarios are pretty restrictive, but it's a good way to start reasoning about the problem, and it provides kind of some insights that we can use if we want to make the problem more general later on. So right now I'm going to present this setting, and I'm going to present how we can solve problems in this setting using neural networks, basically. So domain annotation in complex data sets, right? Complex data sets can be images, they can be text, they can be complex biological structures. And we usually need a powerful function, right, to kind of represent them in some embedding space and then do some task, right? And so usually what we do is we have some sort of encoder, we extract features, and then we do some sort of, if in supervised learning, we predict a label, for example. And so now if we have a source domain and a target domain here, for example, for daytime and nighttime, we try to if we try to extract different latent representations for each of them using a different function, right, using feature extractors, these latent representations may not be related to each other at all, or we have no way of explaining how they would be related to each other. So we cannot do just transfer learning by training like this, and usually we don't have labels in the target domain. And this is kind of the setting in which we work for this particular paper that I'm describing. So in the source domain, we have labels. In the target domain, we do not have labels, but the features of the target domain are available during training. So now what have people done to use neural networks to solve this problem? So usually what they do is they take, for example, 2 domains, source and the target domain. Here, the 2 domains are just rotated MNIST. And then what they do is they map them to some embedding space. And in that embedding space, they ensure that the distribution, the induced distribution of the instances from the source and the instances from the target domain are marginally invariant. So that means regardless of the label, P of Z of the target and the source domain for this Z embedding is the same. And at the same time, what they ensure is that in the source domain, this embedding is predictive of the labels available in the source domain. So you have to have some sort of label information or some sort of discriminative information for this embedding as you train. And I guess this kind of gradient reversal layer is a pretty standard way of ensuring that this property holds. So do you have any questions about this? Because this is kind of a very old, at this point, pretty classic way of doing transfer learning with neural networks and ensuring that some representation is invariant and then trying to make use of that representation.
I had just a quick question about the setting. So is the assumption always the case that the label distribution in the target domain is identical or very similar to the source domain? Do you expect to see? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So you're asking if does the class prior change?
Yeah, the class priors, or maybe like are the types of like distribution shifts basically corruptions of the original image, or are there other kind of shifts that you're also trying to account for?
So the shifts can, as long as the shifts happen in the image and not in the proportion of the class labels,
I see.
it's fine. And so, of course, there's going to be constraints into what kind of changes can happen to the image, but we don't make explicit assumptions in terms of geometry or any kind of image-related like formula to restrict the transformation. Instead, we use a different criterion, which I'll describe, to kind of encode the style change. So in abstract, in kind of high-level hand-wavy terms, only like style can change, basically.
I see. Okay.
And so that can be kind of, that's a kind of an open problem how to define it in ways that make sense and in ways that are general. But I will describe how I define it here. But in general, this is kind of if this is clear to everybody, I'll just keep going. But I'll just mention that this is kind of has some fundamental problems, obviously. And the biggest one is that that even though the marginal distribution is the same, the conditional distribution of z given y is not the same. And that means the joint distribution of z and y is not the same across domains. And that means that whatever predictor we train here is not going to perform well on the target domain instances, or may not. There's no guarantee that it will, and it can actually perform very badly. And so what people have done in the past to solve this problem is to, in addition to having this architecture, they also have kind of other regularizations to add structure to Z. So what they do is they make sure that it's an autoencoder, so Z can also reconstruct the data. They're also adding things like pseudo labels. So they train it together with some initial labels that the predictor on the source domain can provide on the target domain, and those are going to be noisy. And then we can try to match the joint distributions with those noisy labels instead of just the marginal distributions. And we can add on top of that things like there has to be good clustering structure of Z, and maybe the decision boundary cannot pass through high density regions. So like there has been a lot of papers that just kind of add blocks to this kind of basic skeleton, and to kind of make sure that Z is not trivial and like doesn't overfit to the source domain joint distribution. So we're going to do something similar, but we're going to do that with the by motivation from the data generating process. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, think about why don't these things work, and can we come up with 2 reasons why they don't work? One of the reasons why they don't work is because if we have source domain and a target domain here given by a mixture of uniform and mixture of Gaussian distributions, and we have support overlap between them, then this support overlap is going to have different density in the 2 domains, right? And so you cannot use the same function to map that region to a space in which the output is going to have the same distribution. Because if the input has different density, the output is going to have also different density if you use this one function to do it. Another example is, what if both of them are mixtures of uniforms, right? And so the density, the support overlap that happens in this red region is going to have the same density across the 2 domains. So that's not a problem. But imagine that in this region overlap, the true label is completely opposite. So in one domain, you have one label, and the other domain, you have another label, and then you map them to some invariant space. If you try to map them to a space in which they have the same distribution, you're going to map them to the same point, but that point cannot have 2 opposite labels at the same time. So you're going to have lack of optimality in both of these cases if you use one function, so one neural network, to map them to some Z. And so what this means is that you have to use 2 different ones, 2 different functions to map them to some Z, and people have done that in the past, but there hasn't been actually rationale why the people do this. And so this is one, if there is support overlap between the source and the target domain, this is actually a justification why you have to use 2 different functions to map to the same embedding space. And so to go back to the generating process kind of justification, we have conditional target shift. So we assume that that Y generates X, and the distribution of X being generated from Y, conditioned on Y, changes across domains. So we say P of Y is the same, and P of X given Y is different. And what we have here is that Y represents the abstract concept of 5, Z represents kind of like a generic concept of what the contours of 5 look like for an Arabic digit, right? And X is what we actually see in the image, which is a function of this kind of unified semantic contour of 5. And what happens after a person writes it down and the camera takes the picture and all of that, which is actually kind of represented by theta. And so, so the differences between those different processes are represented by theta. So we can have two different conditional distributions, and theta can have some sort of, you can think of it as parameters that are different across the two different distributions, and it can take on different values, for example, S and T. And so what you can observe from this graphical model is obviously the things that we assumed, which is P of Y and P of Y is the same across domains. P of X given Y is different across domains, but we also observed that P of Z is the same across domains, and also PZ given Y should be the same across domains. So the goal is, how do we actually infer Z from data such that we get these properties as much as possible satisfied without observing Y in the target domain, okay? So one thing that we can assume is that the influence of this theta parameter is minimal on the joint vector X and Y. So that means the changes of the joint distribution across domains are small in some way. And so one way to measure that is the mutual information between theta X and the joint vector X and Y. And that's also, I think it's very easy to show that that's the same as the Jensen-Shannon divergence between X and Y and theta in the source and the target domain. So it's kind of the Jensen-Shannon divergence between these two joint distributions across domains. And so if we want to measure or have this kind of term in the neural network, now we can try to construct an autoencoder that has this in its kind of architecture. Any questions so far?
Just a quick clarification to make sure I understood correctly. So the observations, so we want to find a set of representations Z such that these properties hold. And
yes.
And as a result of these properties, we make this assumption that the influence of theta X is minimal. And in that case, you have your influence be measured by mutual information. Is that kind of?
So the logic is that we assume that this is the generating process because we have to assume something. And in particular, when you assume a generating process, it kind of helps you think about what information you need to make use of to infer different kinds of variables. And so it kind of, and also it breaks down the joint distribution into factors, and you can adapt only one of them. For example, here, only this part changes, and the way in which this part changes has no bearing in the way in which this part would change. So if you assume that P of Y is the same and P of X given Y is different, you've already kind of assumed the generating process. And you have to make these assumptions if you want to do domain adaptation, or you have to make some assumptions. Otherwise, the problem is not solvable, basically. And so having this generating process and having this kind of minimal change are two prerequisites to be able to solve the problem and find a Z that makes sense.
I see.
For example, you have to assume that theta won't change the digit. Because if theta can flip the digit all the time, then it's too difficult to solve the problem. And so one way of enforcing the fact that theta won't change the digit or distort the image is this kind of Jensen-Shannon divergence.
Gotcha. So I guess my only confusion here is, we want the influence of theta to be minimal, or are we assuming that it is minimal? Like, that's my...
We're assuming it's minimal, and then we want to enforce that condition on whatever model we set up.
I see. Okay.
So if we want, so in the population sense, we assume it's minimal. And then in the finite sample case in which we actually develop a neural network, we want to enforce that assumption on the algorithm.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we start with a similar kind of neural network architecture as before, but one thing before I start to describe it is that that can give us an insight of how to design this network is to think of of this graphical model and what information we need to infer Z from X. So given X, if we want to infer Z, we also see that conditional X, it's also dependent on theta X. So what that means is that whatever function you use to map X to Z should also have theta x as input. And so that means that you have to have a neural network that takes, in addition to x, also domain-specific information. And so what we do here to start our neural network kind of setup is that we have the x features, and then we have some domain-specific information that we concatenate with that vector, and we and that can be just a function of the domain index. So each point we know what domain it comes from, right? So we can just add 0 or 1 depending on the source or the target domain, and then let the network learn what these parameters are, basically, or try to. So we have kind of a concatenated vector of domain-specific information and image features, and we have an encoder, and we map this to Z space just like before. And so we also do this we take this information, and then we also train a classifier on it to make sure that in Z space, the Z, at least where we have labels, we have some sort of discriminative property in the embedding space. And so now we also do this with the target domain. We also have target specific information with the target domain features, and we map them to this kind of Z specific, target specific Z vector. And what we do now is we can just also enforce that the marginal distribution across domains is the same in this space. So just like I described before, so we can use either MMD or Wasserstein or all kinds of other distribution minimization techniques to make sure that this holds. And then we can have a decoder just like many other things do. So we can just try to reconstruct the data to ensure that Z has enough structure, right? And what we have so far is that we see that on the left side, we have inference of Z, just like we saw in the graph. We're learning Z from X and theta. And what we have on the right-hand side is mimicking the generating process of X from Z and theta. So this is actually trying to kind of recapitulate what happened in some sense when the data was generated up to some ambiguity. And so if you're trying to mimic the data generating process, what we talked about before is that in the generating process, we also assumed that theta has minimal influence. So how do we constrain the influence of this information in the decoder, right? And therefore in the encoder as well. And so before we describe how we do that, we also have this other component in which we take the the source specific information in this embedding space, and we concatenate the target domain index. And what this results in is a translation from the source to the target domain. So you not only reconstruct the source features and the target features, but you also kind of rotate or transform the source features to the target. And the benefit of this is that in the source domain, you actually have labels. So you're kind of learning how to mimic the target domain with the source data using the target domain kind of change vector theta. And you're trying to learn how to do this such that you do minimal differences between this scenario and this scenario. And so how can you constrain the way in which the reconstruction of the source and the target domain and the translation from the source to the target domain, how can you constrain how different they are from each other in terms of the joint distribution? So this is kind of where the mutual information comes in. So now we have this kind of part. So we have the decoder. So how do we minimize the Jensen-Shannon divergence between these two things, which is the mutual information? So one way to do it is to just concatenate these reconstructions and translations with the label Y, and then we have a joint vector here, and this joint vector is X and Y, right? For translations and for this reconstruction, and the translation is supposed to mimic the target domain. And so what we can do is what has been shown before in GAN, in just general GAN derivations, is that if you train a classifier that is completely confused about distinguishing what's a reconstruction and what's a translation, then these will have the minimized Jensen-Shannon or zero Jensen-Shannon divergence. So kind of adversarial training on these two different joint vectors that kind of tries to confuse a classifier that cannot kind of distinguish what's a translation and what's a reconstruction will minimize the Jensen-Shannon divergence. That's absolute. That has been shown already. But now we don't want to do this because we know that y has a special meaning for us. It's not just a one-dimensional variable; it's a label, and it has semantic interpretation. So this is going to be we're going to have to rely on the network figuring that out when we do this, and that's not something that you can take for granted. So we wanted to find out a different way to minimize the Jensen-Shannon divergence without doing this kind of adversarial training or like a GAN-like training on this with joint vectors. And so we make use of a result which kind of bounds the Jensen-Shannon divergence in terms of other terms that are easier to implement. And so we can think of the Jensen-Shannon divergence as being upper bounded by these three terms. And so the first term is just so if this is the joint distribution in the source domain and the joint distribution in the target domain, the upper bound is the Jensen-Shannon divergence between the marginal distribution in the source domain and the marginal distribution in the target domain. And also two other terms, which are KL divergences. The first one is the KL divergence between the conditional distribution of y given x and some distribution that results from an auxiliary classifier. And also for the target domain, the KL divergence of y given x and some sort of auxiliary classifier. So if we implement some classifier that learns a y given x on both the source and the target domain together, then the KL divergence is going to be between that distribution that results from the classifier and the original source and the target y given x. And so if we think of HC as the auxiliary classifier, and we think of YHC as the label that is returned from the classifier when it's applied on the reconstruction of the source domain data, and we think of YHC trans as the auxiliary classifier applied on the translation of the source domain data, then the way to minimize this quantity is by having two different classification losses using the same classifier. So you're training the same classifier on the translation and the reconstruction of the source domain data, and you basically have cross entropy losses. And so to make it easier to see, instead of having a joint vector with y here concatenated, and then we do adversarial training, what we do instead is that we actually train a classifier on both of these sets combined together, and they're both labeled. So because this is source domain translated to target, and this is just source domain, and so reconstructed. So now if you do this, right, you're basically making sure that they both share the same decision boundary in some way. And so if you ensure this, that you're saying that whatever changes theta makes cannot result in a translation that loses label information. Does that make sense? So I'll stop here for questions and we can go back and forth. This is the key part. The rest is just empirical results. So we can go back and forth. I'm happy to clarify any point in this because it's a lot of different variables and notation.
I had a quick question. So does this mean that like the target domain, you're assuming now that it's derived from the source domain using some transformation, like
Yes, exactly. So we're basically trying to derive the target domain from the source domain. So yeah, it is actually a translation, because you can think of it as, actually, if I do this, you can think that if you map this through here, and then, sorry, this should be T here. So actually I'll go back over here. So if you go from here, you can actually map this vector to this vector using a function. And you're implicitly trying to learn that function as well. So you're trying to learn a translation together with some regularization on the translation itself. So when you translate the source domain data to the target domain, that translation has to be similar to the reconstruction.
Mhm.
And so the way we parameterize the problem allows us to kind of learn theta as a latent variable, almost like the domain specific influence is kind of a latent information that's learned. And we kind of enforce that that information has minimal influence on the generating part, which is reconstructing and translating. And so it's the same theta that we also use to reconstruct the target domain. So we see we kind of coupled things in a way that ensures that theta cannot flip labels when we translate to the target domain.
I see.
Except that we're using the source domain features to translate to the target. And so there we have labels. And so we use this kind of this kind of mimicking, right? Which might not be perfect because we don't have, we might not be able to achieve perfect translation, but it's a regularizing term. And so the more we do this, the more Z is going to have label information preserved for the target domain instances. So whenever we use theta T here, we're going to be able to reconstruct the data using without flipping any labels. And that means that Z actually has label specific information that we can use for prediction.
I see.
So it's kind of the justification for the whole thing is that if you apply the constraint on the decoder, then whatever domain specific information you're using to learn is going to be kind of with minimal influence.
And
may I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Go ahead, C.
Yeah, so if you have multiple target domains that each one of them has different say different translations, do you have to do this setup like for each single target domain, or can you?
So good question. So I think if you do this for multiple target domains, then you would have to basically encode everything, right? So you have to have like more joint vectors. So it'll be 1, 2, 3 right here. And you have multiple thetas here, right? And you have to reconstruct all of them with different theta values.
I see.
And then what you have to do is you have to somehow make sure that you can translate your source domain data to all of them. And then you have to do the Jensen-Shannon minimization in kind of a multiple distribution way. So you have to do pairwise minimization or one versus all or something like that to make sure that all of them have the minimum kind of Jensen-Shannon, but like one versus all Jensen-Shannon in a sense.
So in terms of optimization, is it difficult to optimize or?
So I think what ends up happening if you do this is that all your domains, like all your translations, it would have to have the same classifier in the end. So my feeling, I think from the top of my head, it should be pretty much the same. So like you take all of your different domains and they all have to share the same decision boundary, basically Py given X is here. And so this would have to be just a generalization of this theorem to multiple domains. So you add multiple things here and you have to add multiple Jensen-Shannon divergences, and then you have to see what kind of terms you'll get. But what I believe is that in the end, you'll have different KL terms that will justify this kind of auxiliary classifier that we use on the reconstruction and the translation from the decoder. And so I believe that it would be the same. And also it's the same with multiple source domains as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I had another, but if other people have questions, I can pause mine. I guess I can ask mine now. So I see some similarities between contrastive training and this. So do you have any insights about, so here the consistency that you're enforcing is in the probability distribution in your latent space, like you want the P of Z to be the same in both the target as well as your source domain. versus I think in a contrastive approach where you're essentially enforcing the actual latent space representations to be equal for different kinds of transformations. Is there like a pros and cons of like which can be better and which could be more robust to different types of scenarios?
So it is similar in the sense that instead of a transformation, you could think of doing corruption here, right? Or something like that. Yeah, it's similar in the sense that it's a useful tool for regularizing things and making sure that Z has structure. And so in contrastive learning, I think the goal is to do that, is to kind of learn salient features, right? Or like important features that are kind of robust to kind of corruption. And here we want to, it's similar in the sense that we want structure in Z. The difference is that we actually know what it's not distortion. We want to actually mimic a data set, which is the target domain data set. So we're actually transforming, we're trying to transform it to a specific shape. And we're trying to capture information from data sets that are available to us, which is the target domain marginal distribution.
Yeah. I see. And in this process, do you also get some, like, do you get parameters that kind of encode a style of a domain? Like, could that be used to generate new images or
So if you train this, I don't train this as a VAE, but if you train this as a VAE, which you could do, then the style would be captured in these variables theta, which are basically functions of the domain index. So you can think of theta as like f of d, and d is like an indicator whether it's from the source or the target domain. And so you're learning basically how d influences, how the domain index or the domain influences the image, in what way. And so if you learn that, that's actually the style itself. That's the idea. Obviously, it's very hard. We don't have any guarantees that you will do this, not with Jensen Shannon. So Jensen Shannon is not easy to prove that you will get style in theta and you'll get the correct style every time.
I see.
But empirically, we have shown that we do get the style in simulations. And also we showed that it helps having this data in like real world experiments, which I can describe now. But awesome. Yeah, so let me go forward. So now we do a simulation first. So the first thing is we have two domains, and they're in 2 dimensions. So it's kind of a mixture of Gaussians. And what we do is we have a kind of a mixture of kind of the source domain is kind of the diagonal red and blue, and the target domain is kind of this vertical green and purple. And they have, as you can see here, they have support overlap. So they have, you can see that there is overlap where points have the different label into 2 domains. And they also have different densities. So you can see lower density here for purple and higher density for the blue. So if you looked at the earlier examples of what I showed with difficulty with one function mapping into latent space, this is actually kind of embodies both cases of challenge. And we have shown that like we can actually, when we use just one function, so not 2, but just one encoder to map to latent space, which is Dan here, we see that it does very poorly. And we also see that we have very poor performance if we use 2 different functions we don't encode theta, we just use 2 different sets of weights to map source and target domain. And then we can use our autoencoder, but we can use it without minimizing the Jensen Shannon that I just described. So you just do an autoencoder, you do the translation, but you don't do anything on the translation and the reconstruction. So that's DSA and unreg kind of. And so then after that, we add this regularization, which is the minimization of the mutual information or the Jensen Shannon using that joint classifier. And we see that the performance is dramatically like higher. And it's not optimal because you can see that there's actually the Oracle would not do very well here either. I think there's a lot of overlap between the 2 classes within the domain as well. And so to see actually what happens, because this is 2D, we can actually visualize Z. So we can actually look at Z in 2 dimensions. We go from 2 dimensions to 2 dimensions. and we label it by the true classes or the predicted classes. And then we see how the decision boundary and the joint distribution is captured. So what we do here in the first case is we actually look at what does this look like. So if we don't do any regularization, we just have an autoencoder, what do we capture in Z space? And so what we do is we basically visualize in Z space what the source domain looks like when you map it and you label it by the true source domain labels, and what the target domain looks like when you map it to Z space and you label it by the true labels, and then you see the target domain prediction. And what you can see here is that we actually are able to match, we're able to map the points to the same distribution, right? You can see it's kind of the same marginal distribution, but we're mapping them to the completely different joint distribution, which is what happens. This is a typical problem when you don't do any regularization. And we show that the reconstruction itself is not enough to fix this problem. And so what this results in is in a very bad classifier in the target domain. So this is if you look at Z and you color, right? And so we can see how the joint distribution is not captured properly. And so Z doesn't have the necessary structure that we want. And so now we can also look at for a different run, right? We can see that when we map the points to Z space, we actually have the same marginal distribution, but we also have the same joint distribution. We're able to have the correct label as well. And so if you train a classifier on this guy now on Z, right, because this is where we train the classifier, if we train it here and we apply it here, it's going to be not very bad. So, and that's actually what the numbers were showing earlier. So is this clear? So if there's no questions about this, I'll just go on to real world data sets that we were trying to do this for. And so we worked on, how much time do I have, by the way? I have 10 minutes or maybe 3 minutes. So we did this for an image data set and for a lower dimensional wireless data set. So the first data set is kind of a domain, like a very standard benchmark data set for domain adaptation or transfer learning, in which we have images from 3 different kind of image data sets that were used for different kinds of benchmarks in the past. So Caltech is kind of images that have very nice centered objects. And there's no like clutter. The background is very clear. They're usually in the middle of the image, as you can see on the top. And then we have ImageNet, which was used for object classification as a benchmark data set. But you can see the images here are kind of the real world background, and they're not necessarily in the center, and they're under an angle and stuff like that. And then Pascal data set is actually used for object detection, which is actually a different task. And those images are actually different in the sense that they have like multiple objects. The objects are like on a cluttered background. So you can see how there is a difference of the generating process from a bottle to the image, right? The camera is in a different place and the place is different, and like the lighting is different and all of those things. And we have to predict from 12 classes what the object is. And the second data set is we have 3 domains at different time points. And the features are basically a person walking around with an instrument and measuring signals from different access points, 67 of them. And they record the location where they are in the room. And you have to predict where they were in the room based on the features that they were recording. And so those are 19 classes because it's discretized into a grid. And of course, in different time points, a different person was moving around in different ways. And maybe the instrument was slightly differently calibrated, or like the access points weren't exactly the same, like the same strength or whatever. So there would be a domain shift in this one as well. And so briefly to describe the results. So in each column, we have certain kind of images, training on one kind of images versus testing on another kind of images. And so we have all combinations of these. or ordered pairs, actually, sorry. So, or all pairs of these. And in the top, you have when you just train on the source and test on the target without any transfer learning, using a fine-tuned, a pre-trained ResNet neural network. And so you can see that in some cases it's good, but in some cases it's pretty terrible. And so there is a domain gap between the different domains. And you can see that different kinds of there's different kinds of baselines here. I described them earlier. They use autoencoders, they use pseudo labels, they use kind of clustering assumptions. They're using they're making sure that decision boundaries go through lower density regions and things like that to make sure that it doesn't overfit to the source domain. And then we have our autoencoder without the regularization for just the Jensen-Shannon, and the autoencoder with regularization for the Jensen-Shannon. And we see that we outperform the baselines here. And it's a similar description for the Wi-Fi dataset, which is lower dimensional. This is 67 dimensional. And we also see that we outperform the baselines here as well. And they're similar baselines. So it's just a different set. Here we had to run them and tune them ourselves. Whereas the other cases, we were just trying to recreate the same experimental setting that they used, and we copied their result, which is what people do. And then, so this is also encouraging. And so this is to conclude. So we provided a view on invariant representational learning, motivated by the data generating process. We've presented a neural network-based approach to implement that. We showed that we have encouraging empirical performance on diverse data sets, simulated and real. And I think a main drawback of the approach is that it uses Jensen-Shannon. Jensen-Shannon is a good way to not do any kind of geometry or any kind of image-specific things, so you can work across different kinds of data sets. But what it assumes is that in the original space, you would have support overlap. If you don't have support overlap, then Jensen-Shannon is always going to be the same, regardless of how different the distributions are, because it relies on density ratios. If you look at the formula, it's like P over Q log something, right? Kind of like KL. So there's now different ways. We're working on different ways to mathematically represent what it means to have minimal influence of data on the joint distribution. And in future work, we want to actually work in a more general setting in which we have a general generating process where the joint vector X and Y, or whatever variables we have observed, are generated from some latent features or abstract features, some of which are invariant, some of which are changing, such that this change is constrained in some way. And this is a much more general representation of the joint distribution and its change across domains. And it doesn't necessarily have to assume that the class prior is the same. And so this is something that people are working on, and this is the next step. And so one way in which this step would be applied to medical applications is that you can think of these theta here as different kinds of, like, maybe clinical parameters or some sort of genomic differences in sequencing data, for example. And what you want to do is you want to actually represent the generating process of the kind of biomedical data, whether it's sequencing data or maybe pathology slides or other kind of data sets that are for medical applications. And you can try to represent the domain differences as these clinical parameters. In this case, could be patient SNPs, could be some sort of mutation information. And you can actually try to capture those latent things into this kind of latent space. And you can also have something that's always in common. And then you can try to reconstruct the data. And then you can see, maybe you can learn these things. And maybe you can prove some guarantees how much you can learn these things and how accurately, given that you have such rich clinical information. And such that you have rich sequencing information or other things. So this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to just thank my advisors and some people in the lab that were working with me during my PhD work. And I'll take any more questions before we wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter. I think this was a very nice, comprehensive talk that gave us lots of insight. So before we move on to questions, maybe we can give a round of virtual applause to Peter for the talk. Thank you so much. And yeah, let's have the floor open for questions now. I can actually get started with a question. So in the end, you talked a little bit about the Jensen-Shannon's disadvantages. So if you have like in domain adaptation, if it's like an extreme shift, so let's say hand sketches versus a photograph kind of a setting, would Jensen-Shannon actually be able to would you consider there is enough of a support overlap for it to work well?
Definitely, I don't think so. So even if you have different lighting, it could be different support over. So if you make everything dark, right, you no longer have support overlap. For example, if you flatten your data into like maybe however many pixels you have in the image, you just have that as a random vector, and that's your data, right? If they don't overlap in one of those variables, they no longer have support overlap. So if you just change one like aspect, or if you just change like a small like low rank change like brightness, you already no longer have support overlap. But the way we get away from this is by mapping our data to ResNet specific representation first, or something like that. So we kind of use like a pre-trained like transformation to map our data to some space where we think we'll have more support overlap, and then we're hoping that if we have a CNN that we apply on both of them, then they'll get mapped implicitly to something that has support overlap before getting to the last layer, right? So if you work directly on the features, it would be hopeless. So like if you measure the Jensen-Shannon on the pixels themselves, it will always be constant. But what you're hoping is that the neural network will kind of save you from that, because you're using CNNs and because you're using classifiers and things like that. But it's not principled, it's purely empirical. And so yeah, that's.
Thank you. Any other questions for Peter? I guess we are close to our time also, but if you have further questions, you can reach Peter. We'll share his email address, and you can also post any questions on our website or under the YouTube video, and then we'll be sure to pass it along to Peter. We'll put up the recording today on YouTube later, and so feel free to watch it. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week. So thanks again, Peter, for the talk.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.